When we talk about the super empath, we're not referring to someone who is simply kind or overly emotional. That's a common misconception and, frankly, a dangerous one. In reality, the super empath is an individual with an extraordinary capacity for emotional depth, intuitive intelligence, and resilience. They are often misunderstood because their power lies beneath layers of receptivity and compassion, traits that our culture doesn't always recognize as strength. But make no mistaking, this is not weakness. This is a refined kind of psychological awareness that few people possess. The super empath doesn't just feel emotions. They absorb and process them at a level that borders on the spiritual, but is grounded in the neurobiological and psychological realities of high sensitivity. They notice patterns others miss. They pick up on incongruities in tone, body language, and intention, often before those around them are consciously aware of them. And because of this heightened sensitivity, they are frequently the first to sense danger in a relationship, even if they don't act on it immediately. Now, this level of awareness is a double-edged sword. It makes them incredibly compassionate and generous, but it also makes them prime targets for manipulation. Narcissists, in particular, are drawn to this empathic energy like moths to a flame. Why? Because the super empath offers what the narcissist lacks: so depth, authenticity, and a capacity for love that isn't transactional. And for a narcissist whose identity is hollow, maintained by illusion and external validation, that kind of connection is intoxicating, but it also provokes a deep, often unconscious envy. The irony is that narcissists mistake the empath's compassion for naivety. They see patience as pliability, kindness as a weakness to exploit. And in the short term, they're right, because the super empath will often give the benefit of the doubt. They'll rationalize the narcissist's behavior, internalize the blame, and even try to fix what was never theirs to fix. But beneath this outer vulnerability is an evolving awareness, a slow gathering storm of clarity and inner resolve. And here lies the key psychological distinction. While the narcissist is rigid, the super empath is adaptable. That adaptability is the precursor to transformation, knowledge, when they finally see through the mask, when they understand that what they're dealing with is not a broken person in need of saving, but a manipulator in need of control. They shift. And once that shift begins, it is unstoppable. This is not a story of victimhood, it's a story of latent strength. The super empath is not defined by how much they endured, but by the moment they decide to no longer betray themselves. That moment changes everything. It is the beginning of their exit. But more than that, it is the beginning of a reclamation. The world desperately needs this kind of strength, the kind that doesn't seek to dominate, but to understand and restore. But that restoration has to begin within. And for the super empath, the first step is recognizing that their depth is not their downfall. It's their edge. If you feel deeply, see clearly, and suffer quietly, it's not because you're weak. It's because you were built to wake up. The relationship between a narcissist and a super empath is not just emotionally volatile, it is psychologically archetypal. It reflects a deeper conflict between illusion and truth, ego and essence, control and connection. On the surface, it might seem like a standard toxic relationship dynamic, but it's far more layered than that. The narcissist and the super empath are drawn together because they represent opposites that activate one another. And that activation, though it often leads to suffering, also carries within it the potential for profound self-realization, if it is understood correctly. Narcissists are fundamentally fragmented. They construct a false self, a sort of psychological armor, because the authentic self was deemed unacceptable, often at a very young age. Their survival strategy becomes domination, validation seeking, and emotional manipulation. They need control not because they are strong, but precisely because they are brittle. Their identity is a house of cards, carefully arranged to shield them from a reality they cannot face. This is not a judgment. It's a clinical and philosophical truth. Narcissism is not self-love. It's self-abandonment disguised as grandiosity. Now, contrast that with the super empath. The empath is not armored. They are open. They engage with the world through connection rather than control. Where the narcissist sees vulnerability as weakness, the empath sees it as a path to truth. And therein lies the paradox. The narcissist is drawn to the empath's authenticity because it represents everything they've suppressed or lost touch with. At first, this connection feels magnetic. There's intensity, even euphoria. But over time, that same authenticity begins to feel threatening to the narcissist. Why? Because the empath's presence, their emotional clarity, and their refusal to reduce human relationships to transactions starts to reflect the narcissist's hollowness back to them. And so begins the toxic tug of war. The narcissist starts to chip away at the empath's sense of reality. It's subtle at first, gaslighting, undermining, passive-aggressive jabs. It carefully timed silences. It's not done at random. It's done with precision. The narcissist is playing a game of psychological chess. But the empath, for a time, doesn't realize they're in a game at all. They think they're in a relationship. And so they double down on compassion. They try harder. They give more. They excuse behaviors, rationalize inconsistencies, and sacrifice their own needs to preserve a connection that's already started to rot from within. But, and this is critical, the super empath is not static. They evolve. And as they begin to question, to analyze, to reframe their experiences through a more discerning lens, the power dynamic shifts. They start to realize that love is not the same as codependency. That boundaries are not barriers to connection, but prerequisites for it. And once that realization takes hold, the narcissist's control starts to slip. That's when the exit becomes inevitable. Understanding this dynamic is crucial not just for those who've lived it, but for anyone seeking to navigate the complexities of human relationships. You cannot love someone into becoming whole. You cannot fix someone who benefits from keeping you fractured. What you can do, what you must do, is recognize the pattern. Step out of the dance and reclaim your agency. When you stop confusing emotional labor with love, you stop dancing to someone else's dysfunction and start walking toward your own freedom. There's a moment in every toxic dynamic, particularly between a narcissist and a super empath, when the veil begins to lift. It doesn't usually happen in a burst of clarity. It unfolds gradually like a dawning realization you can't unsee. And it's not always loud. Often it arrives in silence. Those quiet hours when something doesn't quite add up, when you start replaying conversations and realizing they were never really conversations at all. They were manipulations dressed up as intimacy. The super empath begins to awaken when their inner world, their values, instincts, and conscience begins to conflict with the external reality the narcissist insists is true. This awakening is psychologically profound. It is the turning point where perception shifts from idealization to realism. The empath up until this stage has likely lived in a state of cognitive dissonance, holding two conflicting beliefs simultaneously. This person loves me, and this person is harming me. It creates confusion. It fragments their sense of self. But as awareness sets in, the empath begins to reassemble the pieces. And this reassembly is not merely intellectual, it is emotional, spiritual, and biological. The body keeps score, as Bessel van der Kolk would say, and the empaths to trust those subtle keys. The tightening in the chest, the fatigue, the gut instinct that something is wrong. This is where psychological clarity takes root. It's no longer about the narcissist's behavior. It's about the empath's interpretation of it. They stop justifying the inconsistencies, stop romanticizing the chaos. And most importantly, they begin to question the guilt that's been weaponized against them. Because if there's one thing narcissists excel at, it's inversion, flipping reality so that their cruelty becomes your fault and your pain becomes a testament to your supposed inadequacy. But once the empath stops absorbing that shame, once they begin to recognize that guilt as an implanted emotion rather than an authentic one, they take back control of their narrative. Now, this is not an easy process. It's disorienting. There is grief involved, the death of a dream, the loss of who they thought the narcissist was, and perhaps most painfully, the loss of who they thought they were in that relationship. But within that grief is something vital, truth. And truth, as difficult as it is, the foundation of genuine liberation. It is the beginning of psychological sovereignty. You see, the narcissist thrives in ambiguity. They manipulate through confusion, through blurred boundaries and emotional fog. The empath, once awakened, begins to cut through that fog with discernment. And that discernment becomes a weapon, not of violence, but of clarity. They stop explaining themselves, and they stop trying to fix what was never broken in them to begin with. And slowly, steadily, they begin to detach, not with hatred, but with understanding. That's when the game ends. The narcissist may still try to bait, to provoke, to reel the empath back in, but the hook no longer finds purchase. The empath has seen the pattern, and more importantly, they've seen themselves. Clearly, perhaps for the first time, the moment you stop asking, what's wrong with me? And start asking, why am I tolerating this? That is the beginning of your power. When the super empath finally decides to leave, it doesn't happen in the way the narcissist expects. It's not theatrical. It's not chaotic. It's not some dramatic outburst that feeds the narcissist's narrative of the over-emotional partner. No, it's quiet, it's calm, it's deeply calculated, and that's precisely what makes it so devastating to the narcissist. Because the empath, once awakened, doesn't just leave physically, they disconnect psychologically. And for the narcissist, that loss of emotional control is intolerable. The narcissist survives on emotional leverage. They need to provoke reactions. Tears, rage, confusion, even silence, because those reactions force their sense of power. They don't see relationships as mutual exchanges of vulnerability. They see them as battlegrounds for dominance. And for a long time, the empath played that role, unwittingly, reluctantly, but consistently. They argued, they explained, they defended. But when the empath detaches, all of that stops. The narcissist suddenly finds them shouting into a void. And that void is terrifying. What's important to understand here is that the empath's exit isn't impulsive. It's the product of a long internal process. It's the result of months, sometimes years, of observing patterns, processing betrayal, and coming to terms with the fact that the relationship was never what they thought it was. And that realization cuts deep. It forces the empath to confront a very difficult truth, that their love, their loyalty, their sacrifices, none of it changed the narcissist. Because it was never about change, it was about control. So when the empath leaves, they don't just walk away from a partner. They walk away from an entire system of psychological captivity. They stop trying to decode mixed signals. They stop rationalizing abuse. They stop betraying their own values in the name of keeping the peace. And in that act of leaving, they reclaim the very thing the narcissist tried to take from them, agency. Now, from the outside, this might look like an ordinary breakup. But internally, it's an existential rupture. For the narcissist, it triggers what's known as a narcissistic injury, a profound blow to their inflated sense of self. Suddenly, they are no longer the center of the empath's world. They're not being begged to stay. They're not being fought over. They're being ignored. And for someone whose identity depends on external validation, that kind of indifference is shattering. What's more, the empath often leaves not with bitterness, but with clarity. And that's perhaps the most painful part for the narcissist. Because in that clarity, the narcissist is exposed, not to others, but to themselves. They are forced for a fleeting moment to confront the emptiness they've been hiding from. And they will do everything they can to avoid that confrontation. Smear campaigns, hovering, guilt-tripping. But it won't work, because the empath isn't running away. They're moving forward. This stage is not just about leaving a toxic relationship. It's about stepping into a new psychological identity. One that is not defined by pain or survival, but by purpose and autonomy. When your exit is built on clarity, not chaos, it doesn't just close a chapter. It ends the entire narrative of control. After the super empath exits, the true aftermath begins. And it's a study in contrast. On one side, you have the narcissist stripped of their emotional supply, flailing in confusion, rage, and shame. On the other side, the empath begins an uncomfortable but liberating process of integration and healing. This is the critical phase, because what follows the exit is not just silence. It's a complete restructuring of both psyches, and the psychological consequences are profound for each party, though in opposite directions. For the narcissist, the collapse begins almost immediately. It's important to understand that narcissistic personalities are constructed around an illusion, a grandiose self-image that is maintained through constant reinforcement from others. The super empath, because of their depth and devotion, becomes a primary source of that reinforcement. When that source vanishes, the narcissist is forced to confront the one thing they've spent a lifetime avoiding themselves. But they don't confront it with humility or introspection. They confront it with defense mechanisms, rage, projection, denial. They scramble to restore the illusion, often by finding a new source of supply, launching smear campaigns, or attempting to re-engage the empath through guilt or manipulation. This isn't just about missing a partner. It's about existential panic. The narcissist's identity is built externally. So when the empath, whose attention once validated that identity, detaches completely, the narcissist experiences what's called narcissistic injury, an internal collapse that mirrors the kind of spiritual void that drives their pathology in the first place. They are not mourning the loss of love. They are mourning the loss of control. But while the narcissist is unraveling, the super empath is entering a very different kind of crisis, one of rebirth. It's painful, yes. There is grief, confusion, and a sense of psychological disorientation. But that pain is meaningful. It's directed. It points toward growth rather than regression. The empath starts asking questions that were once unthinkable. Why did I allow this? What inside me needed this dynamic? What part of me must now evolve? This is the difference between suffering that traps you and suffering that transforms you. The empath, now free from psychological bondage, begins to do the hard work of reclaiming their identity. Not as someone who is endlessly giving, but as someone who gives with discernment. They start setting boundaries. They explore what true self-respect looks like, often for the first time. And as they begin to rebuild, what emerges is not the same person who entered the relationship. It is someone forged by fire, someone who now embodies a deeper sense of sovereignty. This contrast, the narcissist's collapse and the empath's awakening, illustrates a fundamental psychological principle. Control is brittle, but truth is resilient. The narcissist operated through illusion, and illusions break on the weight of reality. The empath, in contrast, was rooted in something real, even if they lost sight of it for a time. And now that truth becomes their foundation. When the mask falls and the mirror rises, one crumbles and the other ascends. What emerges after the super empath's exit is not just personal healing. It's the beginning of a larger transformation, one that has implications far beyond the individual. Because once the empath has seen the architecture of manipulation, once they've learned to distinguish between love and control, between connection and entrapment, they don't just recover, they evolve. And in that evolution, they become something that the narcissist never anticipating, a force of truth. The empath's greatest power was never their sensitivity. It was their capacity to see into people without flinching, to feel the full weight of another's emotional world without recalling. For a long time, that power was turned inward, used to excuse abuse, to rationalize cruelty, to carry burdens that weren't theirs. But once they come through the fire, that same capacity becomes sharpened into discernment. They still feel deeply, but now they pair that depth with boundaries. They still care, but not at the expense of themselves. What emerges is not a hardened cynic, but a matured warrior, someone who understands the difference between being compassionate and being complicit. And this evolution is existentially threatening to the narcissist. Because what the narcissist fears most isn't abandonment, it's exposure. The super empath, once awakened, holds a mirror up to the narcissist's illusion, not with vengeance, but with clarity. Their very existence refutes the narcissist's narrative. They don't have to speak a word. Their calm, their independence, their refusal to engage in the emotional tug of war is a living contradiction to everything the narcissist tried to enforce. And here's the paradox: by walking away, the empath delivers the one blow the narcissist can't withstand, the loss of psychological control. But let's take this further, because this isn't just about what happens between two people. It's about what happens culturally, socially, even spiritually, when truth begins to replace illusion. When individuals like the super empath begin to step into their full clarity, their impact multiplies. They begin to speak more honestly in relationships. They stop enabling dysfunction in families. They raise children with emotional intelligence instead of emotional debt. They become leaders who recognize manipulation for what it is, and refuse to replicate it. In short, they become pattern breakers. And pattern breakers are dangerous to systems that depend on unconscious compliance. So the final act of this story isn't revenge, it's transformation, not just of the self, but of the environment. The super empath just escaped the narcissist's grip. They change the entire game. They don't seek to destroy, they seek to illuminate. And in doing so, they make it harder for manipulation to hide, for control to masquerade as love, for illusion to pass as truth. That's what makes them a threat. Not their emotion, not their kindness, but their clarity, their refusal to forget, their refusal to play small. When the super empath rises, they don't just heal, they lead. And that, ultimately, is the narcissist's worst nightmare.